Hello? All right, so now we're getting into the techniques in this chapter that I remember. Yesterday we went over the Neville Big Dick technique. Joking, kind of. But no, the technique we went over yesterday, it was the beginning of the visualization, right? In which that is what Neville is most well known for. And it's also what Joseph Murphy was rather well known for, in which he explained to the masses in The Power of Your Subconscious Mind in a very effective manner. And The Power of Your Subconscious Mind is a book that probably has spread this information about visualization over the years, over the decades, since it was originally published in 1960, about these very vivid visualization techniques that Neville talks about. I would think that The Power of Your Subconscious Mind actually spread this type of advice more than Neville's advice. However, I would say what we're about to read today is like straight out of Neville. I would actually be surprised, the section that we're going to read today from chapter 6, Practical Techniques in Mental Healings, if this wasn't something that Murphy got, at least in part, directly from Neville and Abdullah. It just sounds so much like what Neville always talks about. But again, to emphasize and repeat, which is what I do on this channel, is emphasize and repeat and make penis jokes. The general picture, the general approach to these techniques is not something that one person created. It is something that we've known about throughout the ages, as people like to say. It's something, these manifesting techniques are something that really kind of started to have a renaissance in the United States in the 19th century, and then really picked up at the end of the 19th century into the early part of the 20th century, into the middle part of the 20th century. And that's where people like Joseph Murphy and Neville come in, is actually later in the game, you could say, like in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, when this stuff was already very established. And Neville and Murphy both presented these ideas in a very differently, but both in very articulate ways that, helped explain and kind of get us into them in a modern, pragmatic way. And I would argue, as most of you know, that Murphy tended to be much more practical and pragmatic than Neville was. And you're going to see an example of that today. So the technique we're going over today is the mental movie method, is what Murphy calls it in this chapter. And Murphy writes, the Chinese say a picture is worth 1,000 words. William James, the father of American psychology, stressed the fact that the subconscious mind will bring to pass any picture held in the mind and backed by faith. Act as though I am and I will be. Okay, so again, William James was far before Neville's time. This idea that you will, act a certain way and it will come to pass. That's not just Neville. Neville articulated it beautifully, and he was so dramatic and theatrical. He really got his point across well. But you see William James and many others discussing this concept in detail well before Neville was talking about this stuff. Murphy writes, a number of years ago, I was in the Middle West lecturing in several states. We'd probably call that the Midwest today. And I desired to have a permanent location in the general area from which I could serve those who desired help. Yeah, Middle West actually in this story. All right, never mind. That's totally irrelevant, the Middle West, Midwest thing. Anyway, I desired to have a permanent location in the general area from which I could serve those who desired help. I traveled far, but the desire did not leave my mind. So Murphy wanted to have a location somewhere in the middle of the United States. One evening, while in a hotel in Spokane, Washington, I relaxed completely on a couch, immobilized my attention, and in a quiet, passive manner, imagined that I was talking to a large audience, saying in effect, I am glad to be here. I have prayed for the ideal opportunity. I saw in my mind's eye the imaginary audience, and I felt the reality of it all. I played the role of the actor, dramatized this mental movie, and felt satisfied that this picture was being conveyed to my subconscious mind, which would bring it to pass in its own way. The next morning, on awakening, I felt a great sense of peace and satisfaction. And in a few days' time, I received a telegram asking me to take over an organization in the Midwest, which I did, and I enjoyed it immensely for several years. So that's right out of Neville. I mean, again, I have a feeling that Murphy got the specific, that like talking about the theatrical actor dramatic approach here for this mental movie technique, I feel like he might have gotten some of that from Neville and Abdullah if he really did study with Abdullah, which he probably did. If Murphy said he did, he probably did. But yeah, I mean, if you're familiar with Neville, which virtually everybody on this channel is, you've heard these kind of stories before. You know, what's interesting is that Murphy did this just once, you know, and he felt like a deep peace. He released it, let it go, and then a few days later it happened. As we've gone over many times, when you do SATs, or whatever you want to call them, and I'll link above to a recent video I did on this. For a lot of us, it's not always like that. It's not like you just do it once and it's over. It's something you have to repeat night after night. And often, you know, I've just noticed working with people, working with myself on this, you can do SATs after night after night. You can get that peace and relaxation and that feeling of relief, like it's really happening. And it still might not happen quickly or at all in the way you think what you want to happen. It's not always as straightforward as Murphy makes it sound like here, and as Neville often makes it sound like. There's often more to it, as we discuss. But the idea of being able to evoke a feeling fully and then feeling that release and relief, that is something that we can always do. And that in and of itself is very powerful and a very good way to feel better about your life, and a wonderful way to release stress of being worried about not getting a desire to happen for you. So there's a lot of nuances to this. And frankly, you know, Murphy here, like Neville often as well, does not cover the nuances in this particular section. You know, it's not always going to be as simple as you feel it being real, go to sleep in the feeling, and then it happens. It can be, and I think the more training and practice you do with SATs, like Murphy was, you know, had a considerable amount of training doing techniques like this, I think the easier it is to then have your manifestation occur rather rapidly. All that just felt worth saying as a side note to this, okay? We're not always going to go to sleep, feel satisfied, and then have something manifest quickly, is what I'm getting at. That's important to note. Murphy continues here. The method outlined here appeals to many who have described it as the mental movie method. I have received numerous letters from people who listen to my radio talks and weekly public lectures telling me of the wonderful results they get using this technique in the sale of their property. I suggest to those who have homes or property for sale that they satisfy themselves in their own mind that their price is right. Ambulance. So you have before you go into this reverie, into SATs, you already have in your mind's eye that you got the right price. Then I claim that the infinite intelligence is attracting to them the buyer who really wants to have the property and who will love it and prosper in it. After having done this, I suggest that they quiet their mind, relax, let go, and get into a drowsy, sleepy state, which reduces all mental effort to a minimum. Okay, this is like SATs. This is like what we're always talking about, right? Getting into that relaxed state. Or not what we're always talking about, but like what Neville always talks about. Then they are to picture the check in their hands, rejoice in the check, give thanks for the check, and go off to sleep feeling the naturalness of the whole mental movie created in their mind. They must act as though it were an objective reality, And the subconscious mind will take it as an impression, and through the deeper currents of the mind, the buyer and the seller are brought together. I love that. Through the deeper currents of the mind, right? Very cool. A mental picture held in the mind, backed by faith, will come to pass. Again, I mean, that's, this is a fundamental technique, or one of the techniques you can utilize, and that you've certainly heard about if you're into Neville or if you're into Joseph Murphy. Very powerful. Very, very powerful for some people. If it does not work for you, don't worry about it. Again, one reason we're running through this chapter is Murphy's giving many different techniques. We're finally getting into the techniques. They're not just visualization techniques. A lot of people have difficulty visualizing. I will say that you do not have difficulty visualizing when I say elephant. You think of an elephant right away. If you say a word, there's a picture that immediately comes to mind for virtually everybody. That is visualization in its own way. That's the basis of autosuggestion. There's so many different ways of getting an idea implanted in the mind, okay? And, as William James said, act as though I am and I will be. You can act as you want to be by simply stating something that you want and implanting it in your mind. So we're moving along. Very valuable technique. I'll be back soon. We might have a podcast episode before the next section of the chapter. But any questions, let me know. And as always, if you want to go deep with this stuff, I can counsel you on it as well. Have a good one. Bye.